People like to push the buttons and talk about fighter pay, and you don't ever see us coming out and talking about it or doing whatever, because I don't give a shit. When I got 20-something-year-old Jake Paul, a fucking YouTuber, talking about fighter pay, or these other guys on the internet, we know what the hell we're doing over here. And at the end of the day, my philosophy is always this: it's nobody's business what these fighters are making. None of these guys are under some type of gag order in their contract. Any fighter on the roster can come out and tell you guys what they make. Ask them what they make. What'd you make tonight? They can tell you. They don't tell you. You know why they don't tell you? Because they don't want you to know. Listen, if you don't like how we run our business, go start your own.
Something's changing inside the UFC, and it's not just another fight night. Behind the bright lights and roaring crowds, a quiet rebellion is brewing. Fighters who once kept their heads down are now speaking up, uniting in locker rooms, gyms, and private group chats. There's talk of walkouts, of organizing, of taking back control from the machine that made them rich in fame, but not in fortune. The whispers started small. A few veterans complaining about bonuses, a handful of rookies comparing payslips. But within weeks, those whispers turned into something the UFC had never seen before: solidarity. Fighters who used to compete for spotlight are now standing shoulder to shoulder, demanding one thing: respect. Not the kind that comes with championship belts, but the kind that shows up in contracts, medical care, and bank accounts. This isn't just about money anymore. It's about power and who truly has it inside that octagon. For years, Dana White has been the immovable force, the kingmaker who built an empire on discipline, loyalty, and fear. But now that empire is trembling. Fighters are realizing that the same system that turned them into warriors also chained them to it. Every punch thrown, every scar earned, it all comes back to one question echoing through every gym: if we're the ones fighting, why are we the last to get paid? The rebellion isn't official yet. No union, no contracts signed. But you can feel it, an energy that wasn't there before. Coaches feel it. Promoters sense it. Even Dana does. And when fighters start fighting for themselves instead of just the company, the balance of power begins to shift. But this was only the beginning. Because what came next would shake the entire sport to its core. Then came the announcement that hit the combat sports world like a thunderclap: a $7.7 billion deal between the UFC and Paramount Global. Overnight, the sport's entire foundation shifted. The old ESPN pay-per-view model, the fortress that had defined UFC's business for years, was gone. In its place, one massive empire rose, uniting every event, every broadcast, and every fight night under a single streaming titan, Paramount Pulse. Executives called it a historic partnership, a new era of accessibility. 12 numbered events, 12 fight nights, and dozens of behind-the-scenes programs would now live under one roof. The UFC, once locked behind paywalls and exclusive deals, was about to go fully mainstream, reaching millions more viewers than ever before, or so they said. Inside the boardrooms, champagne popped. The suits saw record profits, global exposure, and a marketing ecosystem that stretched from CBS primetime to late-night talk shows. Dana White beamed with pride, calling the deal transformative, a victory for both the sport and the fighters. "Everybody wins," he said with that familiar swagger. But behind the smiles and headlines in locker rooms and training camps, the mood was different. Fighters scrolled through the news on cracked phones between sparring sessions, watching billion-dollar numbers flash across their screens and wondering what it meant for them. For years, they had been told that the UFC's value would eventually trickle down. Yet as the checks grew larger for executives, the fighters' pay barely budged. The shockwave wasn't just financial, it was psychological. The fighters realized the game had changed again, but not necessarily in their favor. To the public, it looked like progress. To those bleeding for the brand, it felt like déjà vu. And soon those quiet doubts would turn into open defiance. When the cameras turned toward Dana White, he wore that trademark grin, half confidence, half challenge. To him, the $7.7 billion Paramount deal wasn't just a business move, it was vindication. The critics, the fighters, the journalists, they could all relax now, he said. Fighter pay will go up. Simple as that. He hit the podcast circuit like a man on a victory tour. On Pardon My Take, he called the deal incredible for the fighters. He spoke about visibility, opportunity, and the dawn of a new chapter for mixed martial arts. His tone was pure swagger, the kind that had built the UFC into a global juggernaut. Everybody wins with this, he said. The fighters get seen by more people, the fans get more content, and the sport keeps growing. This is good for everyone. It was the kind of soundbite that headlines love: clean, confident, quotable. But behind that polished delivery, many heard something else, a man selling a dream that fighters had heard before. Dana promised bigger performance bonuses, better exposure, and long-term rewards. But he never mentioned numbers, percentages, or guarantees. When reporters pressed for specifics, he pivoted, talking about how fighters are making more than ever and bonuses will go up. It was classic PR: deliver optimism, dodge accountability. For casual fans, it sounded convincing. For the fighters who'd spent years scraping by on $12,000 show money, it sounded hollow. Because every time the UFC landed a major deal, the same promise echoed through the gyms and the same reality followed: higher profits for the brand, not necessarily for the people in the cage. Still, Dana's confidence worked. For a moment, it quieted the noise. But soon the numbers would tell a very different story. Behind all the celebration, the numbers painted a far uglier picture, one that no press conference could polish. Since 2019, the UFC's total revenue had more than doubled, jumping from roughly $600 million to well over $1.3 billion by 2024. Yet through all that explosive growth, one figure barely moved the fighters' share of that money. Year after year, it hovered stubbornly between 18% and 20%, the same cut they'd been getting when the company was half as profitable. To put that into perspective, athletes in major sports leagues like the NBA and NFL take home nearly 50% of total league revenue. In those worlds, every TV deal, every jersey sale, every broadcast bump directly lifts player salaries. But in the UFC, the money flows upward to executives, investors, and shareholders, while the athletes who make the brand worth billions continue fighting for scraps. Fans noticed. Analysts noticed. Even longtime loyalists began asking uncomfortable questions. On social media, threads began to surface comparing UFC fighter pay to boxing purses and NBA contracts. One viral comment summed it up perfectly. Bonuses go up, sure, but what about the basics? You can't buy a house with a $50K knockout award. That became the heart of the debate. Dana White touted the new deal's expanded bonus pool as proof of progress. But for fighters on the lower tiers of the roster, the ones still earning $10,000 to show and $10,000 to win a few $1,000s more in bonuses, felt like throwing water on a house fire. The math didn't lie. The UFC had become a multi-billion-dollar empire, but the hands that built it were still paid like contractors, not champions. And the more the public saw those numbers, the angrier the locker rooms became. The silence didn't last long. Within weeks of the Paramount announcement, respected veterans began breaking ranks, and when legends speak, people listen. Georges St-Pierre, the face of an earlier golden era, called the New Deal a loss for the locker room. To him, it wasn't about bitterness or ego, it was about fairness. The company is worth billions, he said in an interview, but the athletes who risk their lives should not have to beg for a fair share. His calm tone only made the message hit harder. Then came Chris Weidman, the former middleweight champion, who went even further. It's time fighters get full-time pay and healthcare, he said bluntly. We shouldn't have to work side jobs just to train. His statement spread like wildfire across social media, clipped, quoted, and shared by fighters from every weight class. Soon the frustration turned into a movement. A petition demanding a fighter union gained over 50,000 signatures within a month. Hashtags like "Not fair pay for fighters" and "You we're the UFC" trended for days. The locker room energy had shifted. What once felt like individual complaints had become collective anger. And then came the leak, a screenshot of a mid-tier fighter's $20,000 take-home pay after taxes went viral on X. Thousands of fans reposted it with disbelief. Main event, $20K. How's that even possible, one user wrote. We built the empire, another fighter tweeted anonymously, but we can't afford to live like kings. It was a line that summed up the moment, proud, bitter, and defiant. The image of unstoppable warriors was cracking, replaced by one of exploited workers finally realizing their worth. The question now wasn't whether fighters would speak, it was how far they were willing to go. And that's when Dana White decided to strike back. Dana White didn't flinch. When the storm hit the petitions, the leaked pay slips, the headlines calling for reform, he did what he's always done, doubled down. Sitting under the bright studio lights, he leaned back in his chair, smirked, and said what only Dana White would say. If you don't like how I run my business, he snapped, go start your own. That line spread like wildfire. Some fans cheered his no-nonsense attitude, that same ruthless mindset that built the UFC from nothing. But to the fighters already on edge, it sounded like mockery. Instead of empathy, they got defiance. Instead of a conversation, they got a wall. He didn't stop there. On another podcast appearance, Dana rolled his eyes at broke fighters whining online and threw in his favorite jab. We pay our people well. You don't see any of them quitting, do you? He even called out YouTuber boxers like Jake Paul for talking nonsense about fighter pay and bragged, we know what the hell we're doing over here. It was classic Dana brash, unfiltered and completely unapologetic. The man who had built an empire by betting against everyone wasn't about to start explaining himself now. And maybe that's what made him so polarizing. To some, he was the tough CEO protecting his company's integrity. To others, he was the face of everything wrong with the fight game, a billionaire telling the people who bleed for him that they should be grateful. But here's the thing about arrogance, it has a way of creating enemies faster than allies. Every dismissive comment, every shrug of the shoulders, every smug grin only added fuel to the fire. And soon that fire would explode into something the UFC couldn't control. It happened quietly at first, just another fight night in Las Vegas. A packed arena, flashing lights, the hum of anticipation. On paper, nothing unusual. But behind the scenes, deep inside the betting markets, something strange was brewing. Around 1 p.m. on fight day, analysts noticed an odd pattern. Heavy money, not casual bets, but sharp action started flooding in against a heavy favorite, a young featherweight named Isaac Dahlgren. His odds, once a dominant 250, suddenly collapsed to nearly even. The kind of swing that doesn't happen by accident. The UFC's integrity partners raised the alarm. Dana White was notified. He called Dahlgren and his lawyer, directly asking the obvious questions. Are you injured? Do you owe anyone money? Did someone approach you? The fighter denied everything. The event went on. That night, under the bright lights of the Apex Center, Dahlgren stepped into the cage looking confident. But 3 minutes later, it was over. A sloppy takedown, a half-hearted defense, and a guillotine choke that looked more like a surrender than a submission. Even the commentators went silent. Something didn't feel right. Within hours, sportsbooks froze payouts. DraftKings and FanDuel refunded over $5 million in suspicious bets. The Nevada State Athletic Commission immediately withheld Dahlgren's $30,000 purse pending investigation. The next day, the UFC cut him from the roster. Fans were stunned, but insiders weren't. They'd seen the warning signs for months, fighters struggling to make ends meet, whispers of backroom deals, the temptation that comes when you're broke in a billion-dollar company. The scandal wasn't just about one fight or one man. It was a symptom of a deeper sickness, desperation, festering beneath the surface. And for the UFC, this was the crack that threatened to split the empire wide open. Once the betting scandal hit the headlines, the floodgates opened. Fighters began talking not just about Isaac Dahlgren, but about the system that made his story possible. Vince Morales, a journeyman bantamweight, went public first. He revealed that years earlier, someone had offered him $70,000 to influence a fight more than he'd earned in an entire year of legitimate bouts. He turned it down, but his voice cracked when he said why it was tempting. That's life-changing money when you're broke. Others followed. Vanessa Demopoulos, who supplemented her income through side gigs just to cover training costs, admitted she'd been approached with similar offers. Lando Vannata, a fan-favorite lightweight, told of strangers contacting him after losses asking for inside info before fights. None of them took the money, but their stories painted a grim picture of a sport where survival had become harder than fighting itself. The scandal wasn't just about integrity. It was about vulnerability, a system that pays most athletes so little that corruption becomes a risk, not a choice. When fighters make $10,000 to show but spend nearly that much on coaches, nutritionists, and medical bills, one shady offer can feel like salvation. Dana White called them isolated incidents, but fans knew better. This wasn't a few bad apples, it was an entire orchard starving for sunlight. On social media, fighters began posting their real expenses, showing how little was left after taxes and training costs. The public outrage grew louder. And for the first time, the UFC's image built on toughness, discipline, and glory started to look fragile. Because the truth was out beneath the spotlight of the octagon, some of its warriors weren't fighting for fame anymore. They were fighting just to survive. The morning after the scandal broke, Dana White did what no one expected. He called in the FBI. Cameras caught him storming into UFC headquarters with that familiar intensity. His jaw locked, his message simple. If anyone's fixing fights, we're coming for you. He told reporters he'd already met with federal agents twice. We will be your worst enemy, he warned. You try to cheat in this sport, we'll make sure you go to prison. It was the kind of statement that made headlines bold, fiery, decisive. But beneath the surface, it raised the one question the UFC couldn't afford to answer. If everything was fair, why did it take a scandal to act? For years, the league had brushed off concerns about fighter pay, betting integrity, and internal accountability. Now with the FBI officially involved, those old cracks were impossible to ignore. The organization that prided itself on control suddenly looked vulnerable, its image of dominance shaken by whispers of desperation and corruption. White framed the FBI move as proof that the UFC took integrity more seriously than anyone. Yet fighters saw something else: panic. Because if the system had been strong, this crisis would have never happened in the first place. Fans flooded social media with skepticism. They call the FBI after the damage is done. One comment read, "How about calling a union lawyer next time?" Others wondered aloud if the investigation might uncover more than anyone expected. Not just gamblers or fixers, but the deeper rot of underpaid athletes pushed too far. For the UFC, this was a turning point. The brand had built its empire on control. But once federal agents step inside, your cage control is the first thing you lose. While the betting scandal dominated headlines, another story was quietly coming to a close, one that had been a decade in the making. The UFC antitrust lawsuit, first filed back in 2014 by a group of former fighters, finally reached its end in 2025. After years of legal wrangling, the company agreed to pay out a staggering $375 million settlement. For the fighters who had risked their reputations by taking on the most powerful organization in combat sports, it felt like vindication, at least at first. They had accused the UFC of using its dominance to suppress wages, lock fighters into restrictive contracts, and manipulate the market to keep competition down. And now, finally, a court had recognized what they'd been saying all along: the system wasn't fair. Checks began rolling out. Some veterans received life-changing sums, a few $100,000 here, over $1 million there. Even legends like Anderson Silva saw compensation that reflected their historic value. But once the initial celebration faded, reality set in. The settlement came with no policy reform, no new structure for pay transparency, and no commitment to future fairness. It was at best a payout, not progress. Fighter Renato Moano made headlines when he refused his $200,000 share, entirely calling the deal hush money. "They're paying us to stay quiet," he said. But silence is what got us here. His defiance turned into a rallying cry across social media. In the end, the lawsuit's victory felt hollow. The fighters had won on paper but lost in practice. Nothing in the UFC's machine had changed. No new contracts, no revenue sharing, no real reform. The empire had paid its fine and moved on. And for the people inside the cage, the fight for justice was still far from over. After the scandals and lawsuits, the UFC needed a win not in the cage but in public perception. And the Paramount era was their answer. Dana White and the TKO executives rolled out a slick new narrative. Reform was finally here. Fighter bonuses were increasing. Exposure was at an all-time high. The Paramount deal, they said, would change lives. Press releases celebrated the progress. Fighters would now appear on free-to-air CBS broadcasts, reaching millions of new fans. The performance of the night bonuses reportedly jumped from $50,000 to $75,000. Promotional content flooded Paramount Pulse and social media, showcasing fighters as global stars. On the surface, it looked like a revolution. But dig beneath the gloss and the numbers told another story. The base pay, the actual guaranteed income most fighters rely on, hadn't budged. Preliminary fighters were still earning around $10,000 to show and $10,000 to win, the same rates they'd been paid nearly a decade ago. Meanwhile, the UFC's annual revenue now sat comfortably above $1.3 billion. MMA journalist Ariel Helwani summed it up best in a viral interview. When NBA players make 50% of league revenue, they benefit directly from every new TV deal. UFC fighters, on the other hand, are getting 0% of that $7.7 billion. Not a cut, not a share, nothing. That single quote shattered the illusion. Because while Dana White was boasting about historic growth, fighters were realizing that exposure doesn't pay rent. Being seen by more fans didn't mean being paid more. It was the same playbook dressed in new colors, more content, more cameras, more talk of opportunity. But the structure unchanged. The UFC had evolved into a global media empire, but its foundation remained the same one, built on the labor of fighters still waiting for their share of the spotlight to finally mean something. By the end of 2025, the UFC stood at a crossroads, an empire gleaming on the outside, cracking from within. Billion-dollar deals had elevated the brand to global superstardom. Paramount's partnership promised exposure and prestige. But beneath the surface, the same questions refused to die. The lawsuits, the betting scandals, the growing unrest in the locker rooms, all of it pointed to a single truth: something was deeply broken. The fighters had carried the company through every era, the blood, the knockouts, the rivalries that built the spectacle. They had filled arenas and built pay-per-views that minted billionaires. Yet most still lived paycheck to paycheck, juggling second jobs, praying not to get injured before payday. The gap between glory and reality had never been wider. 2025 had exposed everything: the illusion of reform, the limits of loyalty, and the cost of silence. Some fighters cashed their settlement checks. Others refused, demanding something that couldn't be bought: fairness. Across gyms, whispers of union talk grew louder. For the first time, even those who once feared speaking out began to question the system that had defined their entire careers. Dana White remained defiant, confident that the UFC's machine would keep running. But momentum has a strange way of shifting. Empires rarely fall overnight. They erode one crack at a time until the roar of the crowd can no longer drown out the truth. So here's the question that still hangs over the octagon as the lights fade. Will the sport evolve? Or will the fighters keep bleeding for someone else's empire forever? Because this isn't just about contracts or bonuses. It's about worth and who gets to decide it. What do you think? Has the revolution already begun? Or is it still waiting for its champion?